All right, starting this week, we're going to start looking at the so-called monotheistic religions, beginning with the most ancient of them, Judaism. And you can see from this slide here. Let me get my pointer up here a sec. That the big three, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are sometimes called the religions of the book or the Abrahamic religions, because they do share a lot of culture, and they share a lot of kind of traditional stories, and kind of sacred persona and patriarchs sit at the root of all three of these religions, although we'll also clearly see they are also very distinct from one another. So I found this slide that's kind of a Venn diagram that shows you where these religions, where they intersect and where they differ. And you can see at the middle here some things that they all share. They're all monotheistic. That is, they all are centered around the belief in a single deity, and as such, they make claims of exclusivity that the Eastern religions and the polytheistic religions that we've been looking at simply do not make. Also, Abraham, particularly Abraham, but also Moses, and many other figures in the traditional histories and stories of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam share a common ground. Abraham in particular, is a very important one, particularly to Judaism and Islam. All three of them kind of originating from what's called Southwest Asia here. I would say Middle East is probably a better terminology. These are kind of the desert religions of the Arabian Peninsula, of the Levant, of Mesopotamia, and what Christians call the Old Testament. There's lots of shared heritage there as well. And this is just a short list. There's lots of things that where many of these religions overlap, and so we'll be calling attention to these along the way. All right, but to Judaism in particular, as I have here, it's arguably a much more organized religion than its Eastern counterparts. There was no, there's no pope of Hinduism or Buddhism. They are kind of by their nature much more diffuse and polyphonic religions. Judaism too. There's no pope of Judaism. There's no one kind of central rabbi, we might say, but it is centered around kind of a shared history, a shared culture, a shared narrative that in the Jewish tradition goes back to the very beginning of things, to the creation of the world, which is in the hands of the deity, who goes by a number of names, but kind of the most famous, kind of the core name, most sacred name for the God of Judaism is Yahweh, and we'll explore that name and what it means a little bit later. One of the things that we find that's very unique about the Jewish faith is this notion that it centers around a chosen people, an ethnicity, a group of people chosen, set apart by God, and the spiritual history of the Jewish people is marked by a continuing dialogue between God and themselves, be it through kind of personal encounters between the God and the prophets and other figures throughout their sacred history, but certainly communicated to the Jewish people throughout time through the sacred scripture of the Torah. The kind of the first 5 books of the Jewish scriptures. More on that in just a second. Handed down from the various patriarchs: Abraham, Moses, Joshua, Elijah, Jeremiah, King David, throughout the centuries on down to the present day. And we'll also see that Jews are also bound together by a really kind of a history of suffering, of exile, of being scattered throughout the world. The term diaspora refers to kind of the scattering of the Jewish people throughout the world, and this notion of kind of a secure homeland, the centrality of Israel, and particularly the city of Jerusalem as a sacred city granted to the Jewish people by God, is also centered to kind of Jewish identity. So there's this notion, there's kind of this rhythm in Jewish history of kind of coming home and then being exiled, returning home and being exiled, destruction, rebuilding, destruction, rebuilding, kind of this back and forth, this time of reconstitution, gathering around, coming back to God, then falling away and being scattered. And there's that kind of that back and forth, kind of up and down rhythm to Jewish history, which is kind of all part of their kind of their core identity. So history binds them together. Geography, the sacred land of Israel, binds Jews together. The ethnicity of the Jewish people binds them together. So here's a timeline of Jewish history and heritage. As you can see, it's very complicated, and you can have a look at this on your own. But I just wanted to kind of call attention to a few things in the traditions of Jewish history that illustrate this kind of this push-pull that I was just referring to. One of the important ones is the Exodus from Egypt. So in Jewish tradition, the Jewish people were slaves in Egypt for many, many years, and then God calls them out and uses the figure of Moses to kind of call to bring the people out of slavery, to go to Pharaoh and demand that the people be let go. This is the part in Jewish history kind of marked by the famous 10 plagues, if you're familiar with these stories. And then you have kind of the development and the constituting the establishment of the kingdom of Israel. And you have kind of the high point under King David, and then that comes to a close with the invasion by the Babylonians, and then also the Assyrians coming in, destroying Israel, and then also destroying the first temple. We'll see the temple first built by King Solomon around the year 900 BCE as a kind of a permanent sacred house for the deity. Is absolutely essential to a core aspects of Judaism. And so the Babylonians come and destroy that first temple. The Jews eventually return, they rebuild the temple, and then the Jewish lands are taken over by the Romans. And then in the year 70 AD CE, the Romans destroy the rebuilt temple. And since then, that temple has not been rebuilt. We'll talk more about this later, but where the Jewish temples once stood is now an Islamic shrine. And of course, Jerusalem today is not only kind of a hotbed of religious controversy, but also political controversy. To whom does that city belong? It's sacred in many ways to all three of the big three monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And the Temple Mount, where the temple once stood, is now in the hands of Muslims. And for kind of hardcore fundamentalist Jews, this is in many ways the ultimate insult. And not all Jews, and in fact, it's a minority of Jews, I would say, that can hold this position. But for some Jews, the Jewish people can only kind of reconnect to God. The Messiah will only come when the temple is rebuilt in its proper location. And then fast forward down through the ages, all kinds of tragedies for the Jewish people. Massacres, exiles, persecutions, and then in fairly recent memory, of course, the Holocaust under the tyranny of the Nazis too, the murder of an estimated 6 million Jews during that short time period. And then on the heels of that, the establishment of the modern state of Israel, which again, if you've glanced at the news at any point in your lifetime, you know that issue in and of itself, the establishment of Israel and the tension with the Palestinian people right next door, is one of the kind of the ongoing, seemingly insoluble political issues of the day. In terms of kind of Holy Scripture, much more at the center of the religion than I think you would some of the sacred stories that we found in the Eastern religions. Scripture, Tanakh as it's called, is the absolute source of kind of the revelation of the deity, the revelation of how one should live, how one should connect to the divine for the Jewish people. The Torah, or sometimes called the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Jewish scriptures, that would be Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are considered to be the highest and most holy. That is kind of the ultimate in terms of sacredness of Jewish scripture. Second, the Nevi'im, kind of the writings of the prophets. This would be books like the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah, where God will sends the prophets to Israel to call them back to Him. And then the Ketuvim, which is just a Hebrew term meaning kind of writings, and this is kind of a catch-all for everything else. It would be poetry like the Psalms, wisdom literature like the Proverbs, and underneath those three banners you can find most of what we would categorize as the sacred scripture. So here's kind of a list of how they're usually arranged. So Torah, the most ancient, the most sacred, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. This tells the stories of the creation of the world, the coming of the calling of Abraham, the enslavement of the Jews in Egypt, the calling out, and then Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are largely given over to what we call the law. And for Orthodox Jews, how does one connect to God? How does one be saved, so to speak? It's by following the letter of the law. And so it's in these books that we get this very, very distinct, very, very precise, in many ways, very, very rigid ways of living one's life that govern kind of all aspects of daily behavior, what you should wear, what you should eat, when you should do things. It's very, very precise. And this is, again, at the center of ancient Judaism. The kind of the prophetic books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets here. Lots of kind of traditional Jewish history, but also you get this kind of the story of the Israelite people falling away and they being called back by prophets sent by God. And then the Ketuvim, wisdom literature, poetry, songs, lament literature, traditional stories, apocalyptic literature, kind of a catch-all for the rest of Jewish scripture. So the first 5 books, the Torah, the most sacred, it's the tradition was that it was traditionally ascribed to Moses, handed down to him in a kind of a sacred mystical fashion from God on Mount Sinai. So one of the famous stories in Jewish tradition is that while the Israelites are wandering in the desert, having been freed from slavery in Egypt, but still awaiting a secure homeland, Moses goes up on the sacred mountain of Mount Sinai, which was somewhere in the kind of the Sinai, what we call the Sinai Peninsula, kind of between what we would call Egypt and Israel today. And it's there that he receives the 10 Commandments, kind of the core of the Jewish law. But there's also traditions there that Moses receives kind of all of these traditional stories, and then he writes them down. Most scholars, kind of secular scholars, think that that's not a literal truth. Most think that the Torah was likely kind of developed as we think, most of the sacred literature did, circulated for centuries as an oral tradition that was told within a culture group, keeping kind of the sacred lore alive, but then kind of later on written down, again, once kind of the Hebrew alphabet catches up and there becomes a kind of a scribal tradition to the culture. And it's around 500 BC, BCE that we think that probably the first of kind of the written aspects of this Torah were written down. Very likely in response to the Jewish people going to exile into Assyria and to Babylon. There was more kind of a desperate need, perhaps, to preserve their culture and to save it. And so, once you're scattered by exile, the oral tradition of the close group doesn't really work all that much anymore. And so it was written down to preserve it, and it has been preserved. So yes, in the Torah we get the Jewish story of the creation of the world. We get the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, the eating of the fruit, the casting out from the garden. We get the famous flood story with Noah and his ark, the Tower of Babel, in which the deity scatters the people by confusing their tongues. It's kind of an origin story of kind of where the various languages from different cultures come from. If I had to choose kind of one word that makes kind of Judaism kind of wholly unique compared to particularly kind of the Eastern religions. Of course, Judaism has a lot in common with Christianity. It's kind of the source tradition for Christianity as well. Is this notion of covenant? This idea that there is an agreement, a kind of a handshake, excuse me, between their principal deity Yahweh and the Jewish people themselves. Usually recognized as kind of starting with Abraham. Abraham is the first patriarch that God calls out, that Yahweh calls out to make this covenant. Calls him out of his homeland, tells him to follow me, follow my commands, go to where I'm leading you, and if you do so, I promise I will establish a new land for you, a new kind of dynasty for you. Your children will number like the stars in the sky. It all starts with Abraham, and then at various stages through Jewish history, God renews this covenant in different ways through various patriarchs. So Abraham, like I said, is an important figure in all three of the big three monotheistic religions. So in the Jewish tradition, God promises Abraham that he will have a son, and that son will be the kind of the prime ancestor for the Jewish people. And as the story goes, Abraham is already an old man, and his wife Sarah, his principal wife, is also getting old, well beyond childbearing years. But God has this promise, and the story goes that in the Jewish tradition, Abraham and Sarah they panic. And they say, we're getting too old. How can this promise possibly come true? So again, with Sarah's agreement, and again, as was kind of the polygamous, man having multiple wives or concubines, it was kind of the way the culture worked in this era. With Sarah's agreement, Abraham takes a concubine, Hagar, one of his servants, a younger woman, and sleeps with her, and that produces a son, Ishmael. And so in the Jewish tradition, Ishmael is kind of, Abraham didn't have a son with his primary wife. That seemed to be what God was promising, but we took the story into our own hands, and we got the next best thing, Ishmael. But of course, in the Jewish tradition, God keeps his promise, and Sarah, miraculously in her old age, does become pregnant, and then they have Isaac, who becomes the primary ancestor for the Jewish people. What's really interesting, it's in this story is where you see kind of the major split between Islam and Judaism, and also Christianity by extension. Is in so in the Jewish tradition, Ishmael, once Isaac is born, Ishmael is kind of second-class citizen. He no longer kind of carries the primary patriarchal blessing. He's still part of the household, but he's not the primary ancestor anymore. In the Muslim tradition, as we'll see, Ishmael is the key son. And in Muslim tradition, it's Abraham who goes with his son Ishmael down into the Arabian Peninsula, where they build the first, I guess you could call it the first mosque, what the Muslims today call the Kaaba. It's the cube, which they still purport stands, or at least the foundation of stands, in the great mosque in Mecca, which we'll look at today. So it's Abraham and Ishmael go down, and they really establish monotheistic worship of Allah together. Whereas in the Jewish tradition, once Isaac is born, it all follows from Isaac. So, scholars disagree about the historicity of how much weight do we put to kind of literalness of these traditions. How much weight did even the Jewish people back then put on kind of the literalness of these stories? It's a very interesting, and it's a very, in many ways, kind of open question. But according to the Jewish scriptures, Abraham was a man who was from this town of Ur, down here in kind of ancient Babylon. This would be kind of modern day Iraq down here. And God calls him away and speaks to him, Yahweh, the principal deity. And in faith, Abraham, who was a very wealthy man, packs up everything and follows the direction of the God who takes him up the Euphrates River here, up through what we call the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, and down into this land where ultimately the land of Canaan, where Jerusalem will eventually be built, where Israel and Judah will eventually be established. So kind of sowing the seeds and building the foundation of what will one day be the promised land of Israel. So, like I said, this notion of covenant appears at several places throughout the Jewish scriptures. When the deity decides that he's had it with the sinfulness of humanity, and decides to destroy it with a flood, almost kind of a do-over, a return to zero. Um, but Noah and his family are set aside as the only faithful ones left on the face of the earth, and so he saves Noah and his family with the ark. And following the flood, God makes a covenant with Noah, saying that I will never destroy humanity in this way again. God is on humanity's side, giving humanity another chance, and so reestablishing this agreement. The covenant with Abraham, often taken to be the principal one, the real spark in terms of ancient Judaism. Um, God makes this agreement with Abraham by circumcision, the removal of the foreskin from male genitalia, as a very serious sign of what's the word of dedication, of no going back. So circumcision, as a sign that God has chosen Israel as his people. They will have a homeland, and they will become numerous, and they will populate the world. So there's that promise of geography and family and ethnicity. Later on with Moses, the covenant takes on a much more defined shape. It's through Moses that we get the law and the Torah, sacred scripture, the Ten Commandments, how one should live, kind of the rules for living, for setting the Jewish people apart from the people that surrounded them. And this promise that if the Jews obey the law, they would become a treasured nation close to God. And now they have a very clear, defined scripture to connect them and to the divine and to guide them day to day. Once Israel is established, God also renews the covenant with King David, who is often taken to be the king who kind of marks the high point of Israeli kind of cultural and political life. And it's under the rulership of King David, or really under the rulership of his son, King Solomon. God commands King David to build a temple, but then King David, because he has too much blood on his hands as a warlord, God decides that his son Solomon should build that temple in Jerusalem instead. And so it's it's the idea that it's here that Yahweh finds a permanent home in the sacred, in the most sacred place, within the most sacred temple, within the most sacred city, within the most sacred country. And part of this promise is that ultimately the Messiah, the anointed one, the chosen one, which will ultimately kind of restore the kingdom of Israel and bring into kind of perfect harmony the connection between God and the Jewish people, will ultimately derive from the bloodline of King David. And kind of looking ahead to Christianity, Christians believe, the tradition is that Jesus is the one born from the line of King David. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew, the first of the Christian Gospels, begins with a genealogy, which shows how Jesus was indeed born from the line of David. And Christians believe that Jesus is the promised Messiah in the Jewish tradition. Traditional Orthodox Jews believe, of course, no, that Jesus is not the promised Messiah, and that the Messiah that will restore the kingdom of Israel is still being waited for. So the kind of the core group of patriarchs here, Abraham, his son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob, they kind of form kind of the core of the traditional history of the ancient Jews, and their story of kind of exile return, slavery, and salvation. So the tradition is that Jacob, his 12 sons of Jacob, go to Egypt during a famine in their own land in Canaan, and they stay there. And because Egypt has the food and Canaan does not. And so over the next 4 centuries, the Jews become numerous and prosperous in Egypt. And so the Egyptian people become nervous about them, are jealous of them, and so they're enslaved for many, many years. So then Yahweh then calls Moses out of the desert to rescue his people. They are taken into the wilderness in the Exodus, which really means the way out, the road out. And it's there that God meets Moses on Mount Sinai. We get the establishment of the law, the Ten Commandments. This is where we get most of the source for the traditional Jewish festivals, feasts, rituals, worship, day-to-day living, before they finally move on to take Canaan 40 years later, through military means, and finally establish a geographic home, the Kingdom of Israel. Now, the God itself, the God Himself. We usually use masculine terminology for the Jewish God, though the word itself, as I understand it, is at its core meant to be genderless. Yahweh, the sacred name of the deity, which for Orthodox Jews you don't even write it or say it. It's called the Tetragrammaton. And it's for in the Hebrew language, there are no vowels. You kind of plug in the vowels, kind of depending on what kind of consonants are next to each other, and so they roughly transliterate to the kind of the English characters YHWH, which we would pronounce Yahweh, something like that. This is how it looks in Hebrew. As some of you may know, Hebrew is a language that you read from right to left rather than left to right like we do in English. And so here we have the tetragrammaton, which just means four letters, the four Hebrew letters. So this is roughly kind of the Y sound. This is the H sound. This is the W sound, and then again you can see this character and this character are the same. The H sound again, Yahweh, and the word itself is it's a sentence in Hebrew. It just means I am the one who is. I am who I am. And so the name, the most sacred name of the deity, just means something like I simply am. I am the one who exists. I am, interpret it as you will. I am reality. I am the ultimate being, or something like that. And so, yes, this is radically different than anything we see in the Eastern religions. A transcendent creator deity. This is a deity who is not part of nature, stands outside of nature, speaks nature into existence. You don't have that concept in the Eastern religions, where deities are themselves are kind of part and parcel of nature. Maybe the closest thing we get in terms of like Eastern religions, something like the Atman, like an ultimate world soul, or Brahma, the ultimate breath that's out there. But this is that kind of deity that acts in a very personal kind of way. So a transcendent creator deity without origin, form, or gender, despite kind of the traditional masculine father language that's used. But the word itself just kind of speaks to kind of an ultimate reality, kind of a transcendent deity who is also extremely personal at the same time. And so there's a deity that's completely beyond human comprehension, but also comes to humanity in this very human kind of way. This is a deity that's very interested in humanity, interested in his chosen people, and provides for them, guides them, protects them, punishes them, but also blesses them. And when they're scattered, he calls them back. All right, more on this next week.